Chapter 3 of Tractate Bava Basra discusses the laws of acquisition in regards to property. The first Mishnah says, living on a piece of property for a period of time establishes a presumption of ownership, an acquisition, or a chazaka, as it's called. For instance, if somebody was seen dwelling within a certain house for 3 years continuously, it establishes a presumption of ownership for him towards that house, or an acquisition. The same would apply to a pit, ditch, vault, dovecot, bathhouse, olive press, building, irrigated field, a slave, or any other property that provides constant benefit, that the presumption of ownership is established after using this piece of property for 3 continuous years. With a rain-watered field, this ownership is established within 3 years, but not a continuous period. Rabbi Yishmael says, this refers to 3 months in the first year, wherein you could squeeze 1 full crop in the last few months, then 12 months in the middle year, and then 3 months in the last year, totaling 18 months. Rabbi Akiva says it must be for 1 month in the first year, requiring a smaller crop to be established, then 12 months in the middle, and then 1 month in the last year, so 14 months total. Rabbi Yishmael clarifies his opinion refers to a grain field, but by a field of trees, if he had harvested his grapes, picked his olives, and gathered his dried figs within a single year, that would count as if it was done over 3 years and create a full acquisition. The Gemara debates the source for this notion that an acquisition is established after 3 years of ownership. It's suggested to be from the muad ox, a dangerous ox, which is established after it gores 3 times, which was discussed way back in Tractate Bava Kama. Additionally, by property, it would also be necessary for the man on the property to advance a claim on it, just to effectuate his acquisition over 3 years, unlike by the bull. Additionally, the two are actually comparable, as the bull needs to be warned about in its owner's presence, and by this property acquisition, if it's not the man's actual property, then the real owner would have definitely heard about it by word of mouth. So it's similar. Furthermore, harvesting 3 crops in 1 day is not effective to establish an acquisition, and this is similar to the ox, as the 3 gorings don't exist at the same time, so too the different crops must exist at different times. Based on this, it asks, why can't you harvest 3 crops of caper bushes, which grow super quickly over 3 days? And that's said to be because it's still considered to be one extended harvest, as they're still in development. And then growing aspasta, which is a type of animal fodder, with 3 crops over 30 days, would also be insufficient, as they won't be fully grown. Harvesting them over 3 months would work, but it's, as we said, like the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, that the only thing that requires 3 years to create an acquisition is a grain field. So that defines the muad ox as the source for Rabbi Yishmael specifically. So it suggests some verses the others could use as a source for this principle. Alternatively, after a few others, it suggests the notion that the first 2 years a person lives on somebody's property, he probably still holds onto his deed. After 3 years, he's probably lost it, so we don't force a person off of his property if it's contested after this point. And we assume that as he's been there for 3 years, it probably is. Additionally, in such a situation, if the property actually was owned by another man and he lodged a protest against the man who eventually stole his property, the property thief is held responsible to have held onto his deed, as he should have heard about the protest by word of mouth. Okay, very brief intermission. The entire Gemara, the Talmud, and in fact the entire Torah, have a commentary written on them by an individual named Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, an 11th century sage, who essentially compiled explanations and traditions from various sources of these various texts. His commentary is printed in every single edition of the Gemara, and in most editions of the Chumash, the Hebrew book compiling the Torah. And in fact, the Gemara and the Torah are most typically taught and learned in accordance with the commentary of Rashi. Anyways, unfortunately, Rashi actually passed away right in the middle of writing his commentary on the Gemara. You can see it right over here. It says his commentary stops. Fortunately, the commentary wasn't written in order of Tractate, so most of the others have his commentary written in full, with a few exceptions. Rashi's grandson, a sage referred to as the Rashbam, then took over and finished his grandfather's work. However, they differ slightly in styles, and while Rashi chooses to be a bit more concise with his words, the Rashbam tends to expound on concepts a bit longer, and because of this, Tractate Bava Basra winds up being the longest tractate, around twice as long as many other tractates, a significant portion of which is just due to this extended commentary on each page. Although the tractate's fairly long and complex in its own right. Additionally, the other side of the page here is Tosfos, Rashi's other grandchildren, printed in all editions of the Gemara on the opposite side of Rashi, who mostly provide their own commentary, largely debating with their grandfather and various explanations. So those are the main 2 commentaries, although there are dozens of other commentaries printed in the back of the Gemara, giving additional explanations and asking various questions and answers, along with commentaries on those commentaries, and commentaries on the commentaries on the commentaries. So that's important to bear in mind. Anyways, that's just an aside on the topic of commentaries, Rashi, and Tosfos, which are all pieces of information that you should be aware of when studying Gemara or most other Jewish texts. Anyways, it was said that the 3 years of dwelling on property to create an acquisition must be consecutive, meaning not 3 years spread out over a long period. Specifically, this is speaking about where the field is left fallow every other year, even if those around him don't do this also. It does debate from other discussions as to whether the 3 years must be continuous. For instance, it says he must provide evidence of using the property by night too, not just by day. However, if there's a store made for daytime use alone, it would only require consecutive use during the day. This is qualified. It's also said if somebody used the entire piece of land for 3 years, besides for around 100 cubits in the corner, he acquires everything besides for that area, so long as it was suitable for planting. Others say it doesn't even need to be suitable for planting, as the man could have acquired it by putting his animals or his fruit there to make use of it. This is illustrated with a few examples. For instance, there's a case a man came to his house and saw that there was some person living there who claimed he had been living there for 3 years, creating an acquisition. The original owner claimed he hadn't protested as he'd been out of town in markets for the past 3 years. The person on the property said, well, he has witnesses that the original owner had come into town for 30 days, but the original owner claimed that he had done so, but he was preoccupied the whole time with his business, so he didn't realize that there was anybody living in his house. This was ruled to be a valid claim, and the man reclaimed his house. Another incident, a person came to his property and saw somebody living there and asked what he was doing here, and the resident said he had purchased it from some other person who claimed he had purchased it from you. So the original owner said, well, if you're admitting I originally owned it, you clearly haven't bought it from me, and it's ruled that he would get his land back. Yet another case, a man came to his property and saw somebody living there, and the resident claimed he had bought it from a third party, and the original resident said, yeah, well, that man was a thief. So the current resident said, but I have witnesses that I had asked you if I could purchase it from the third party, and you said I should. So the original owner said, well, that's because the third party stole it, but I figured it would be easier to reclaim it from you than to reclaim it from him, so I had you buy it. This was ruled to be valid, but are argues as to the sources. There are incidents cited. It's asked, if two people both argue that their ancestors held possession of a single piece of land and one provides witnesses that he'd been currently living there for the past 3 years, the land goes to him, as he could have just simply claimed he had purchased the land and used it for those 3 years. Others say he needed to have claimed that he had purchased it from the other man's ancestors. Based on this, there's a debate as to whether a person can advance a claim, come back, and then advance a new claim, and it rules that a person can do this. Furthermore, if two men both claim their ancestors owned the property and they both provide witnesses that they had used it for 3 years, but only one brought witnesses that his ancestors had used it, it debates as to who it goes to. This is additionally disputed further, and there are additional points. Another case is brought, a man asked somebody what he's doing on his land, and the current resident said, I bought it from you, and here's my deed as proof. The original owner said, well, that's a forged deed. The other said, actually, yes, it is a forged deed, but that's because I had the original deed, but then I lost it, so I figured I'd make a fake one so that way I had something to present in court. A similar case was disputed regarding a loan. Anyways, it's an argument, as on the one hand, he didn't need to admit that he had forged the document, he could have just said nothing, but on the other hand, it's still worthless as a document. There's another instance, it was said that a man was using land that belonged to orphans, but this man then claimed it was given to him by their father as collateral for a loan. He had then decided to keep the land past his limit so as to consume the produce to repay the debt as opposed to collecting the owed money from the orphans with an oath. It was ruled that this was not a valid claim for some listed reasons, and he had to return the land and collect his loan once the orphans were old enough. Another case, somebody left a date palm to his descendants, and two of them argued which of them were related closer to him to inherit the tree, one of them admitting the other was closer related, so he received the tree, but then it was debated if he should also receive the produce that the other man had claimed from the tree until then. It was said that as he had admitted to impermissibly using the tree, he was also admitting to impermissibly taking the produce, and therefore must return it. Anyways, it brings back up the case as to if two men say a piece of property was their ancestors, one brings witnesses for this, and the other, second man, brings witnesses that he had been on the property for 3 years. Some say the second man could have just claimed he had purchased the land, hence his usage of it for 3 years, so as he chose not to make that very believable claim, he's more likely to be believed, as he could have just made it instead. Others say such a claim doesn't work here, as the other man has witnesses to his point. A case is brought, a man claimed he was on somebody's property for 3 years, but could only bring witnesses that he was there for 2 years. Due to this lack, it said he needs to return the land and any produce he had taken. Although it is said if somebody's using a piece of land and then gets kicked off, he can still claim he was there as he had been permitted to eat the produce, and he then wouldn't need to repay for anything he had eaten, as it's unlikely he'd be so bold as to make this claim if it wasn't true, and documents for this weren't typically written, unlike by the actual land purchase. Yet another case, a man was on a field and the original owner showed up and asked what he was doing there, so the man said he had purchased it from him and had been dwelling there for the past 3 years, and then brought one witness that he had done so. This is said to be comparable to a different case wherein a man grabbed a silver ingot out of the hands of another person, and the original owner brought a single witness that this had occurred, and the grabber said, yes, it's true, but the ingot had belonged to me and I was just grabbing it back. This case with the ingot is debated as there's only a single witness, but that does reduce the significance of his admittance, but he also admitted that he had grabbed it, so he can't now take an oath as to what occurred, as he's now considered to be a thief. So it was said the grabber is like somebody who's obligated to take an oath, but is unable to, and the rule in such a situation is that he needs to return the item. However, it's said that this case just isn't similar to ours, as here the single witness was to support the occupant, unlike by the ingot case, so the man wouldn't be obligated to take an oath. An actually comparable case would be if one witness testified that the resident had consumed 2 years' worth of produce and then needed to return it. Yet another incident. Two men were fighting over a boat, both claiming it as their own. One of them demanded the court seize the boat until he could provide witnesses. It's rules of the court does not seize the boat, but they did anyways here in this case, and it said if such a thing occurs, it said that they don't just release the boat to have them fight over it. Uniquely, it said if two men were disputing over property as to whether it belongs to either one of their ancestors and neither of them can prove it, it said they should just fight it out, essentially, as further evidence could be brought later. It additionally debates this point from other cases. Anyways, back to the original point, it said that if witnesses testify that the original owner was seen loading a basket of his field produce onto the shoulders of the second man, the current resident, he's believed to acquire the property immediately without need for an acquisition. However, if the original owner, without the first 3 years at least, claims the other man was his sharecropper, he would be believed as he'd get to retain the field. Additionally, if the owner was his sharecropper working for him for over 3 years to prevent the field's ownership from shifting to the sharecropper, he needs to declare the property as his own, and the other man is only a sharecropper, as seen in some sources. It's also said a Jewish man can only claim property that belonged to a non-Jewish person through providing a deed as proof, and the same applies vice versa. However, if the Jewish man said that the non-Jewish man had purchased the land in front of an original owner, and then sold it to the Jewish man also before him, he's believed, as if he wanted to lie, he could have just claimed he had purchased it straight from the original owner. Additionally, as referenced earlier, it says if somebody takes a rope and a blade and says he's purchased some trees from a man's field, which he then harvests, he's believed, as typically people aren't so bold as to just make up that they have permission to cut down another person's trees. Other points, if somebody occupies a thin strip of land outside the border wall of a field for 3 years, this does not create an acquisition of the field, as the original owner can just say he wasn't using that produce right over there anyways, it was going to wild animals, so he hadn't protested him staying there. Additionally, if somebody uses a field by impermissibly harvesting orla fruits from trees in their first 3 years, this or from unripe grain in locations where it isn't used, from cracked, barren land, or if the field didn't yield any increase in what he had sown, it doesn't create an acquisition, which it then sources. Additionally, the members of the family of the Reish Galusa, the leaders of the Jewish people in Babylonia, could not establish ownership of others' property, and people couldn't establish ownership of theirs. Slaves also can be acquired, as mentioned, only after 3 years. Acquiring a baby takes effect immediately, even if the mother is also in the house. This is qualified. The opinions of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva had disputed over a rain-watered field if it's acquired after 18 or 14 months. This establishment is based on if either holds that an acquisition can be made with a partially grown crop or not. It's also debated at length as to whether plowing the field can create an acquisition. Additionally, some derive that according to one opinion, if 30 trees were planted in a field, 10 over every 2,500 square cubits, you could harvest 10 every year for 3 years to create an acquisition. This applies only if the trees bear fruits on different years, and only if the trees are scattered across the fields. It's also said if one buyer performs a proprietary act to acquire trees and another man does a proprietary act to get a field, it debates who gets what between opinions. It is, however, stated if somebody sold land and retained the trees, he does also retain some land around the trees, that way he can plant new ones if they die. This even accords with the opinion that people typically sell land in a more generous manner, giving more, as will be explained later. If, however, somebody sold trees and retained the field, there's a debate if the buyer gets some land based on if people sell land generously or not. This is qualified. If other debates if harvesting the 30 trees over 3 years, as mentioned, would validly function to acquire the field. It's also said if somebody sells a palm tree, for instance, the purchaser gets the soil from the tree's base and then downwards to the furthest depths. Others disagree, as they say that to be sold the dirt beneath the tree, it needs to be clarified as a part of the sale. So if somebody wants to not sell the dirt beneath the tree they're selling, he should declare it so before 3 years pass. New Mishnah. There are 3 lands in Israel in regards to the laws of acquisition: Judea, Transjordan, and Galilee. So if the original owner was at a town in Judea and somebody lives on the property in Galilee for 3 years, it's not valid to create an acquisition. They need to be in the same province, presumably so that the original owner can protest if he wants to. Others disagree and say that 3 years are only to give time to the owner to be notified and to travel and claim his property. The Gemara clarifies, actually the first opinion does hold that the protest can be made from a different region. It was just an exception here where it was not permitted, as this was specifically during a dangerous time where such declarations didn't really get spread via word of mouth as people weren't really traveling as much. Additionally, Judea and Galilee were specified to show that they're considered to be separate provinces during dangerous times. It's a debate whether an acquisition can be made on a fugitive's property, as presumably he won't be able to lodge a complaint as he'll be out of the country, hiding from the government or something, but perhaps it could be valid, as maybe the protest could be lodged elsewhere. It's argued further, but it said if somebody becomes a fugitive due to his debts, he could make protests if he wanted, and therefore an acquisition after 3 years would be permitted. But if somebody was a fugitive for committing murder, an acquisition would not be effective, as there's no way this guy could validly make a protest. It also clarifies as to what constitutes an effective protest. Is said to involve claiming the resident as a thief who has taken his property and that he plans on reclaiming it in court. Now, if the original owner protested but told the witnesses to not tell the occupant, some say this is invalid, others say it is, as not telling it directly to the occupant, but the information will reach him eventually. If the witnesses told the protester that they're not telling the occupant about the protest on their own, the same debate applies. If the protester told the witnesses to just tell absolutely nobody, it's invalid. If the witnesses say they're telling nobody on their own, it's a debate. Some say it's invalid, others say that as they weren't forbidden from doing this, they just decided to not do this themselves, they'll tell somebody eventually. It additionally states an opinion, essentially that a protest lodged outside of the occupant's presence is considered to be a valid protest. However, regarding the lodging of the actual protest, some require it to be done before 2 witnesses so they can testify it occurred, and others say it must be done before 3 witnesses to ensure that the protest will actually be spread out and heard by the occupant. Once a man does protest about somebody living on his property, it's said he doesn't need to do so again, although he should relodge it at the end of every 3 years. The protests, however, need to line up and not contradict each other to be effective. Some hold that a protest must be lodged before 2 witnesses, and he doesn't need to tell them to write a document, they can do so without him saying so. Notification of coercion to avoid a transaction, which is a totally separate thing, must be done before 2 witnesses, and there's no need to tell them to write the document. An admission of indebtedness must be done before 2 witnesses, and the man must tell the witnesses to write a document, otherwise they can't do so. Acquiring an item through an exchange must be done before 2 witnesses, and there's no need to tell them to write the document. The certification of documents must be done before 3 judges. The exchange acquisition doesn't need to have the writing of the document specified, even though it's not a court proceeding, as it's typically meant to be written down. Other laws on these unique types of documents are clarified. These and related are discussed. It's said that a gift document written in secret cannot be used to collect the gift. It's a debate as to what such a document is. Some say it's if the witnesses were told to write in hiding, others say if the witnesses were not told to write it in public. There's a practical difference if the instructions were unspecified. It debates the use of such a secret gift document. If the instructions on the writing of the document were unspecified, it's rules that were concerned that such a document was actually written in secret and it's therefore considered to be void. New Mishnah. Any attempted acquisition of property via living there for a while must be accompanied by a claim for it to be considered valid. For instance, if the man was on the property for a while, but then said he was there just because nobody had kicked him off, he doesn't acquire the property. But if he said he's there because he purchased the land from its owner, or it was given to him as a gift, it would result in a valid acquisition. Somebody who acquires the property via inheritance does not need a supporting claim. The Gemara explains this was necessary to state, as it shows, if somebody did purchase the property but lost the deed, so he isn't claiming that it was sold to him, the court doesn't go out of its way to suggest that the land was sold to him, and he possibly just lost the deed. It gives some instances of this principle. These are additionally discussed. For instance, if a man claims the property was sold to him by a third party after he'd been living there for a while, it's a debate if he needs to bring proof that this third party had ever lived in the property at all, as it's possible he just sold it. In fact, it's a debate if the third party can just be seen on the property, not even using it. Additionally, it said that 3 successive purchasers of a field combined to create an acquisition from the original owner, so long as it was all actually written down in deeds. It additionally qualifies this point. New Mishnah. Some people, as they typically have access to other people's property, cannot establish an acquisition of it by living there for a while. This includes craftsmen, partners, sharecroppers, and administrators of property. A man cannot create an acquisition of his wife's property, nor vice versa, nor can a father towards his son, nor vice versa. This applies to the establishment of an acquisition to prove ownership of a property. There would be a valid acquisition if it was given as a gift, or divided between brothers, or taken from a deceased convert, as once this man locks, fences, or breaches the property to any extent, he acquires it in full. The Gemara says there are variants of this discussion, one of which excludes a partner from those who cannot establish a property acquisition. Some say this opinion only allows it when the partner occupies the entire field. Others say it's only where he occupies half the field. Alternatively, it's where the partner occupies the entire field, and the partner can only acquire the field if it's large enough to be subject to legal division. This is additionally discussed. He also says the partners can testify on behalf of each other. This is specifically when a partner is testifying on a document, but he's removing any of his claim to the field, so that way he should have no interest in whether the other man retains the land, so his testimony should be permissible. This principle is additionally clarified in a further debate if such a testimony is permitted. This is additionally discussed. There are further points. Additional point on whether certain testimonies can be accepted if the witness isn't involved but does not benefit from his testimony are discussed. Regarding the point that a craftsman can't acquire an item just by having held on to it, this is only where the item was initially given to the craftsman in the presence of witnesses. Others debate this notion. and it's additionally qualified. It actually brings a source which evidently disproves the point that witnesses are required for the deposit of the item by a craftsman for him to not be considered the owner. Related, it said if a person accidentally was given somebody else's utensils in a craftsman's shop by the craftsman himself, he's allowed to use the utensils until the other man takes them back. This wouldn't apply in a mourner's house or in a feast, and would also only apply if the craftsman gave him an item, not your item. It debates some related cases. On the point of a sharecropper not establishing an acquisition, it's explained to be a generational sharecropper, so they're keeping the entire harvest over a period, so there's no visible difference when the acquisition period begins. However, if a generational sharecropper hired a different sharecropper who worked for 3 years, this would create an acquisition, as the owner would have protested if a new sharecropper had been installed on his property without his permission. If the sharecropper only apportioned some work to others, this would not create an acquisition, as it's possible he was made a supervisor, so he had authority to do so himself. It's also said that a sharecropper can testify on behalf of his employer, specifically where there are no fruits left in the field. It mentions some related principles and laws of testimony. Additionally, while a craftsman or sharecropper cannot acquire property by holding onto it for a long period, their sons can. A robber and his son, however, both cannot establish an acquisition, but the grandson of a robber can. This is qualified, and it mentions that a robber's grandson cannot acquire an item if it's from his grandfather's claim specifically. Some said the robber discussed here is one who has been established to have stolen a certain field. Others say it's only a family who are known to murder for financial gain. Also, a craftsman or a sharecropper can start acquiring items once they quit their job. A son can acquire from his father once he moves and sets up his own house, and a wife can acquire from her husband once she divorces. This is said to be stated to show it applies even with a questionable divorce, where the husband is still obligated to support his wife. Others say that if these men, the craftsman, sharecropper, etc., they actually can acquire the property if they bring additional proper proof that they own the property, although a robber cannot do this to acquire land, and he can only get his money refunded. Some say that if people force a man to sell an item, it's a valid sale. It debates at length as to what the source for this is. In the end, it rules that any forced sale is valid, even for a specific field. It is, however, said a forced betrothal is invalid, as the rabbis could retroactively invalidate it, as was discussed more in Tractate Kedushin. Some related incidents are brought. These are discussed. It was said that a husband cannot create an acquisition of his wife's field by living there for a period. It's said that possibly him bringing proof of acquisition could be invalid, as she could claim that she had only given it to make her husband happy, as seen in some other cases. However, others say that such a concept would only apply to fields that are specifically assigned to payment in the marriage contract, either specified in the contract, stated orally, or brought by her into the marriage as assessed property. It additionally debates this point. It was said that a woman must protest against others trying to acquire her property, which can only really be her husband that's doing this, but this doesn't show a man can theoretically acquire his wife's property, as it's referring to the wife protesting against her husband changing the structure of her property by digging pits in it and similar. This is qualified. Others say the woman isn't protesting against the husband, it's against somebody else, and it's a case where the man used the property while the husband was alive, and then also for 3 years after the husband's death, meaning if the man wanted to, he could claim that he had purchased the land directly from her or from her husband after she had sold it to her husband. Some say that while people cannot establish an acquisition from the property of a married woman, the judges of the diaspora could. Additionally, when we say that a wife cannot acquire property from her husband, this is referring to when the husband had designated a section of land for her food. This would apply unless the woman had a document proving it was a gift. This principle is additionally discussed. There are further points, but the law is said to be that if somebody sells a field to his wife, she does not acquire it, and the husband would receive the produce so long as the money is not hidden. If it was given to her as a gift, she would receive it, and the husband would not receive produce. Related, it said deposits are not accepted from married women, Canaanite slaves, or from small children, but if you did accept, it should be returned, although by the child, a trust should be set up, and if the person had died, it should be returned to their husband, master, or heirs. If, when any of them died, they said the deposited item belongs to somebody else, he should return it to them, and if the custodian doesn't believe the person, it should be returned to the husband or master. Regarding making the trust for a child, this is defined either as buying a Torah scroll so the boy can study, or getting a palm tree which the boy can eat from. It's ruled if a father and son are separated, the son being financially independent, they can acquire from each other. There are related points which are then qualified. Back to the earlier point, it was said a gift or brothers that divide the property or fencing, locking, or breaching property, etc. can acquire the property as there's no challenge to them doing so. It additionally defines these latter cases, saying that breaching a fence and similar is valid if done even a little bit, such as widening a breach just enough that it can be entered or exited through. This case is described further. Other methods of proprietary acts are mentioned. Benefiting some land by placing or removing a stone to seal or unseal water could function. Related, if there are two ownerless fields with a single boundary between them and somebody does a proprietary act in one, he only acquires that field, not the other one. If the man's intent was to acquire both fields and the boundary, it's unresolved if this is effective. It's also unresolved if he does a proprietary act in the boundary divider. There are additionally described rules of proprietary acts. For example, if somebody built a mansion on ownerless property from a deceased convert and somebody else installs the door, the second man would acquire it, as that's the significant act. Similarly, if somebody plasters the wall of a mansion built on ownerless property the size of a square cubit, although some say it must be opposite the doorway, he would acquire the property. It's also said if somebody spreads out mats over ownerless property, he acquires it, and it gives sources from other cases. If somebody throws a turnip into a hole on such ownerless property, he does not acquire it because that does nothing, and then when the turnip grows, that's doing so on its own. It's also said if somebody removes branches from a tree, he acquires it if it was done to improve the tree, such as by doing it on all sides. Similarly, if somebody swept debris from land, he acquires it if it was to improve the land, seen if he removed both small and large pieces of wood. Or if somebody levels the dirt in some land, he acquires it if it was to improve the land, which would be seen if he took dirt from heaps and deposited it into holes to level everything fully. Or if somebody opens some land to let water run through, he acquires the land if it was to irrigate the field, which is seen if he also makes an exit. Examples are brought. It's also said you can acquire ownerless property from a deceased convert by drawing a picture on a wall. Additional similar examples are brought if a non-Jewish man sells property to a Jewish man after the money is given, but before the Jewish man receives the deed, the property is temporarily ownerless and can be claimed by anybody through a proprietary act. Others debate this, and it brings some incidents. These are additionally discussed, and there are some related points on tax law, and also discussed some laws of tithes. These are additionally discussed, and I mentioned the boundaries of the area included in the laws of tithes, which it defines as excluding the regions of Mount Seir, Ammon, and Moab, otherwise known as Damascus, Asia Minor, and Aspamia. New Mishnah. If two witnesses testify that a person used a property for 3 years and the witnesses are found to be false, they need to repay the original owner everything. If two witnesses testify to the first year's use, two witnesses testify to the second year's use, and then two witnesses testify for the last year's use, and they're found to be false, the penalty would be divided between them. If three brothers testify each for 1 year along with an unrelated witness, these are considered to be separate testimonies and are valid. However, they would be considered as one testimony if they're proven false. The Gemara cites the source of this opinion. Other similar cases are cited, which are then discussed. New Mishnah. An acquisition cannot be established through placing animals in somebody's courtyard, placing an oven, millstone, or stove, raising chickens, or by depositing manure into the courtyard. An acquisition can be established by making 10 handbreadth high partitions for an animal within, or by making the partition for the oven or millstone, or by bringing chickens into the house, or by placing the manure somewhere 3 handbreadths deep or 3 handbreadths high. The Gemara explains essentially that these acquisitional acts work as they're done by a partner in the backyard of his jointly owned property. As placing an animal there is not an issue, but the other partner would object to a partition being placed, which resolves a contradiction with a different Mishnah. There are other solutions recommended. It's also said that a partner can prevent the other from doing most tasks in a jointly owned courtyard besides for washing clothes, as it was immodest to do laundry in public and a person should not watch such a thing. There are related teachings on the proper, modest ways of a Torah scholar, how they should dress, how they should set their table, and similar. There's a story, a certain sage would go around and mark crypts, so that way people wouldn't accidentally become impure. He came to the crypt of Avraham, the forefather, and saw his servant Eliezer outside. He asked Eliezer what Avraham was doing, and he said that Avraham was laying in the arms of his wife. So he went inside, took some measurements of the cave, and left. A voice from heaven said, "Well, you were there, you also saw the forefather Jacob, but you should make sure to not look at Adam." But the voice described the remaining dimensions, so that way he wouldn't need to go back in. The sage said that he had seen the heels of Adam, and said that they resembled two sons. It also describes the great beauty of Adam, comparing him to the other forefathers. Another story, a magician would go around to the dead and rob their graves. He did so to one past sage, and the sage grabbed his beard and wouldn't release him, so another sage had to come and free the man by cutting off his beard. There are other stories involving these sages. New Mishnah. Other items, placing a drain spout in somebody's property does not create an acquisition, but its place would, which will be explained. A gutter could create an acquisition. An Egyptian ladder cannot create an acquisition, while a Tyrian ladder can. An Egyptian window, which is one too small for somebody's head to enter, cannot create an acquisition, but a Tyrian window can. Others say the Egyptian window also can. The Gemara gets some suggestions as to what the drain spout's place creating an acquisition means. It could be the establishment allowing somebody to place their drain spout on either side of a gutter. Others say it means that a drain spout can be shortened but not removed. Others say that it means you could build beneath the drain spout but not remove it fully. The gutter there would be different than the drain spout, as a gutter would be made of stone. The remaining points are clarified. For instance, an Egyptian ladder is defined as a small one with less than 4 rungs. There are additional disputes cited. New Mishnah. A beam that protrudes into a neighbor's courtyard at least a handbreadth has an acquisition if left for 3 years, meaning it cannot be removed. The courtyard owner can protest its initial placement. There's no acquisition and no permissibility to protest if it extends less than a handbreadth in. The Gemara says if somebody establishes an acquisition of a beam at 1 handbreadth by 4 handbreadths, the acquisition becomes one of 4 by 4 handbreadths. Regarding the point that you cannot protest if the beam is less than a handbreadth, it's a debate as to who exactly is protesting against who in this case. This is described. New Mishnah. A person cannot open windows of his house if they open into a jointly owned courtyard. If somebody owns a house in one courtyard, he cannot open a door leading to another jointly owned courtyard, as this could increase the traffic flow. Similarly, if somebody adds an attic to his house, he cannot open the attic to a jointly owned courtyard, but he can build a room inside his house or an attic on his house that opens into his own house. The Gemara says this obviously includes a prohibition against opening a window into a separate neighbor's courtyard, and as mentioned, the jointly owned courtyard also. It's a debate if opening windows onto a jointly owned courtyard establishes a permissibility to do so. If somebody builds a wall in front of somebody's window and they don't protest, this establishes a permissibility to do so. It explains the issues with opening doors to other courtyards being that it increases traffic. New Mishnah. On the topic of privacy concerns, within a jointly owned courtyard, you cannot open a doorway opposite a doorway or a window opposite a window. If there was a doorway or a window, it cannot be enlarged or made into two. Within a public domain, a doorway can be opened opposite a doorway or a window opposite a window, and they can be enlarged or made into two. The Gemara brings the scriptural sources for this principle. Additionally, debates as to what exactly is impermissible by enlarging or dividing a window. These concerns do not apply within a public domain, as everything happening in the house is open to the public domain anyways, so there's not much concern as to what the neighbors are saying. New Mishnah. It's impermissible to dig pits or similar beneath a public domain. Others say it's fine so long as the cover is strong enough to hold a wagon laden with stones. It's impermissible to extend balconies or similar from your wall into the public domain. However, you can pull back your own house and then build a balcony. If somebody had purchased a house that already had a balcony extending into the public domain, he can keep it. The Gemara says the reason one opinion forbade digging at all beneath the public domain is in case the covering that he's going to end up installing ends up rotting. Some particular cases are brought and discussed. In the event somebody pulls his own house back in and decides not to build out his balcony, it's a debate if he can extend them out at a later date. Others say it's a debate if he can actually return the wall to its original place. It was said if somebody purchases a house with overextending balconies, he can keep it. It was also said that if it ends up collapsing, he can rebuild it as it was with the balcony extended. It mentions some later points. After the destruction of the temple, many Jewish people wanted to stop eating meat or drinking wine out of mourning, as this was part of the temple offerings, but this was said to be wrong, as then you'd also need to stop eating bread, fruits, or water, which were also part of other offerings. Instead, it was said a person should leave part of his house unplastered, and if making a meal, part of it should be left out, and if a woman is adorning herself, she should omit one part. Scriptural sources for this concept are brought. It's also said that there's a great merit to mourning for the second temple, and those that do so will merit to see the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and also that technically it would be proper, as there were severe decrees in those days against learning Torah, against circumcision, and similar, to stop having children. But it was said to persist anyways, and that it was better to unintentionally violate those commandments than to deliberately violate the commandments by not having children. And that's the end of chapter 3.